you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. Today's podcast is from May 12th, 2019. Join us as we continue our study on the life of Joseph with Pastor Dax.
You guys have read this book, right? You know how it ends? God wins. God wins in the end. And because God wins, so do you, if you belong to God. So the question is, if we're winning because God is winning, why does it so often feel like we're losing? You know what I mean? Sickness or financial troubles, broken relationships, career disappointments, the list could go on and on. God wins, we win, then why does winning so often feel like losing? That's the very thing I wonder if Joseph is thinking, given his recent experience. Not too long ago, he had very bright future, it seemed. He had that special robe that was gifted to him by his father, this thing that kind of cemented his superior status over the rest of his family. He had that pair of God-given dreams that foreshadowed this prominent position that he would have one day. But now, at just 17 years old, everything has gone so terribly wrong. What were you doing when you were 17? Planning your senior prom? Those last few games of varsity baseball? I don't know, but for Joseph, a 17-year-old boy, he's up for auction on a slave block. He's being poked and prodded by potential buyers. He's a victim of human trafficking in a foreign country. God wins. We win. Why does winning look like losing? So as we come to chapter 39, we're going to divide this into three chunks here. We're going to see that the opening paragraph, verses 1 through 6, and the closing paragraph, verses 20 through 23, convey essentially the same message. And that's not by accident. That's by design, as the message that's in the bookends of this chapter are going to help you interpret what lies in the middle, the very dark middle section. And these bookends here, they're here to indicate that what we read about in the middle isn't just a series of unfortunate events in the life of Joseph, but in fact it's the beginning of an answer to the question that we're asking. Why does winning so often feel like losing? So let's look first at the opening paragraph here, and we'll call it the presence and blessing of God. Chapter 39, verse 1. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. So after this interlude of chapter 38 with Judah and Tamar, we return back to the previous scene where we left off in chapter 37. And in the very last verse of chapter 37, Joseph is sold. In the very first verse of chapter 39, Joseph is bought. Now he's a slave. He's taken to the house of a man named Potiphar, the captain of the guard, or it could be translated, the chief of the executioners. To help us think about it, maybe in our terms, we could say that Joseph's new master is like the head of Pharaoh's secret service. And God? Well, where is God in all of this? Where was God in chapter 37 when Joseph's brothers planned to kill him and threw him down into the pit and then sat down to eat lunch? Where was God when Joseph begged his brothers to stop and he was forced to go to Egypt? In all of the abuse and the suffering and the hardship that Joseph endured in chapter 37, God is not mentioned even once. And isn't that exactly how it feels sometimes? That God is distant or absent, missing in action. So in this story, where is God now? Verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph. That line is repeated 4 times in this chapter, twice in the beginning paragraph, twice in the closing paragraph. Joseph may be far away from the covenant family. He may be far away from the promised land, but God is with Joseph. And this is much, much more than just a statement of God's omnipresence, the fact that God is everywhere. The use of God's covenant name here, signified by the all capitals, Lord, Yahweh. This is an echo of the great promises of God's blessings to be with his people. I will be with you. You will be my people. That was a promise made to Abraham. That was a promise made to Isaac. A promise repeated to Jacob. And now, here, despite everything that's happened, this same covenantal type promise is given to Joseph. God is with him in order to bless him. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. And we're going to see that success unfold here in 3 stages, really. Number 1, he was in the house of his Egyptian master. Not out in the fields, not out making bricks under the hot Egyptian sun. He was promoted to work inside the house. No small thing. Secondly, verse 3, his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him. That word attended there is interesting because it's the same word that's used to describe the relationship of Joshua to Moses, of Elisha to Elijah. Joseph becomes Potiphar's apprentice, his right-hand man. And then thirdly, third measure of his success, verse 4, middle of verse 4, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. Joseph runs the household, and just to make sure that you don't miss that, this same point is repeated several times here in the next couple of verses. Verse 5, from the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. Now, it's been at least 10 years since Joseph has been sold into slavery. And now he runs the entire estate of the head of the Egyptian Secret Service, with one exception. Do you see it there at the end of the verse? Potiphar had no concern about anything but the food he ate. That's weird. The food? Why would food be the one thing that Joseph can't oversee? Well, maybe to keep Joseph from poisoning Potiphar. But that doesn't really make sense, does it? I mean, he's got unlimited access to every other aspect of Potiphar's life. He could probably come up with hundreds of ways to assassinate him if that was what he wanted to do. Food. Food? There it is. The opening paragraph. The presence and blessing of God. And it's about time, isn't it? After everything that Joseph's been through, everything he's suffered, finally now it looks like, it feels like he's winning. And that's what you expect for someone who belongs to God, right? Eventually everything works out perfectly. Everything makes sense. Has that been your experience? Looks like it for Joseph, and God has especially blessed him. I mean, it seems like here, everything that he touches turns to gold. Are there any gifts that he doesn't have? And you see, that becomes his next problem. It's like he has one gift too many here, and that's what transitions us from the opening paragraph, God's presence and blessing, to the dark middle section of this story that we're going to call the wickedness and consequence of sin. Notice the middle of verse 6. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." Now this is not an invitation to intimacy here. This is an abuse of authority. It has nothing to do with love. It has everything to do with power. Sexual harassment wasn't invented last year. This is a classic case of someone in a position of authority using that power to coerce sexual favors, like you've read about with a pastor and a church member, or a teacher and a student, or a boss and a secretary. Unfortunately, it was a fairly common treatment of slaves in the ancient world. It's probably safe to say that Joseph was not the first subordinate that this woman had approached with this demand. But who is she, this Mrs. Potiphar here? I have no doubt, given her position, who she's married to, that she was beautiful and affluent and influential, successful. But if you cut away the veneer and look at what's underneath, it's a disaster. It's tragic. You understand that Joseph isn't the real slave in this story. This woman is enslaved to her sin. It says, after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me," but he refused. See, that's freedom, right? Real freedom isn't, now I can do whatever I want. Real freedom is, now I'm enabled to do what God wants. That's a big difference. Now you're free not to sin, something that you could never, ever do or even desire to do apart from a radical invasion of God's grace into your life. This Mrs. Potiphar, on the other hand, she cannot not sin. So don't let her beauty beguile you here. Don't let the allure fool you. What we see when we strip all that away is a pathetic woman who is enslaved to her sin. She can't say no. But Joseph can, and he does. He's the one who's truly free. He refuses. Why? Well, it's not because he's not just as red-blooded as the next guy. And I'm sure that Joseph could come up with a dozen reasons to justify this. You know, I've been lonely for so long. I've come from such a dysfunctional family, and I know that God wants me to be happy. She pursued me. Hey, if I don't go through with this, I might lose my job. Or maybe, if I get on her good side by doing this, maybe I can get my freedom. How about this one? Lord, if you don't want me to do this, then you take away the desire. I like how one author said it. He said, all of that is passivity masquerading as piety. And notice, too, how this temptation comes not when Joseph is at his lowest, but after he's reached the top. After he may want to kick back and enjoy some of the fruits of his labor. There's a lesson for us in that too, I think, friend. You need to be aware of your vulnerability, especially after you think you've arrived. But Joseph here, he refuses the temptation. How? Because that's what we really need to know, isn't it? How does Joseph succeed here when so many of us fail? And his success is traced to three appeals that he makes here. He appeals to the ethical, to the relational, and to the theological. Let me show you those. So let's look first at his ethical appeal. Verse 8, an ethical appeal. But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge." So first of all, Joseph refuses on ethical grounds that Potiphar has entrusted him with everything that he has. In fact, did you notice there, he doesn't even refer to him by his name or even Mr. Potiphar, but he says, "my master." Right? It's a show of respect. He knows his place, and he's not going to violate that master-servant dynamic on ethical grounds. And then notice in the next verse, he makes a relational appeal. Verse 9, "He is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me." Does that sound familiar? It should. We just read it. Look back at verse 5 for just a second here. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field, so he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. Joseph has been given unlimited authority over everything in Potiphar's household, with one exception, Potiphar's food. Now notice, back to verse 9, he says nearly the exact same thing. Again, he is not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except, and he's going to say food again, right? But that's not what he says. He's not greater in this house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you. And it was interesting, several commentators make the argument that food in verse 6 is perhaps a euphemism for sexual intimacy. There's a couple places in the Bible where that is a connection. Maybe, maybe not. It does fit the context, I think, but it's not the point. The point is the relational appeal that Joseph makes here. He's not kept back anything from me except you because you are his wife. You belong to him. So he's refused this temptation on the basis of an ethical appeal to his master, on the basis of a relational appeal, you're his wife, and now those two appeals are undergirded. They're built on this foundation of his theological appeal. Martin Luther famously defined sin as man curved in on himself. Self-absorption, selfishness. When that happens to you, sin will dominate in your life. But Joseph is not curved in on himself here. He's able to refuse her advances in part because he's curved outward towards God. Look at the end of verse 9. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Now listen, because this right here clearly refutes a notion that we are bombarded with in our culture. And that is that sexual sin isn't really sin if it happens between consenting adults. But you see, your consent isn't relevant to that equation. Sexual sin is always sin if it occurs without God's consent. So this is not an affair. This is not a momentary weakness. This is not the result of growing up for Joseph without a mother or having sort of an absent-minded father. Joseph defines this as great wickedness and sin against God. And that is an important way for each of us to fight against sin in our lives. It is to call it for what it is, call it by its proper name, and recognize who it is ultimately that you are sinning against. Because if you take God out of the equation, there's really no such thing as sin. I mean, just do whatever you want, right? Certainly don't waste your time here. Instead, you have to recognize, like Joseph does, that sin is an affront against God and his holiness. Isn't that what David prays in Psalm 51? Against you, you only have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight. This is Joseph's theological appeal here. Sin offends God. And it's this theological appeal which gives credibility and validity to his ethical appeal and his relational appeal. So Mrs. Potiphar, she hears all this, she hears his refusal, and she finds it all so cute, so amusing. What do you know? A religious fella, huh? Well, that's fine. Egypt is a very religious place. But there's no reason to let religion interfere with your life, to hold you back from what you want to do. I know that a lot of us worry about secularization in our culture. But one thing that we need to understand is that secularization is not the abolishment of religion, like it's banned. Secularization is the marginalization of religion, pushing it out to the periphery, out to the farthest edges of life where it doesn't really matter. You want to call yourself a Christian? You want to go to church on Sunday? That's fine. Do that. Just don't let it interfere with your life. Certainly don't let it invade somebody else's life. That's the danger. But Mrs. Potiphar here, she thinks to herself, all right, I hear you. I'll give it a little time. I can overcome your religious objections. Verse 10, and as she spoke to Joseph day after day, he would not listen to her, to lie beside her, or to be with her. Isn't it great to know that all you need to do is resist temptation one time and it goes away forever? Now, temptation is not a one-time experience. It's not a part-time experience. What began here as an initial demand, lie with me, becomes a relentless pursuit day after day. And notice now how that relentless daily pursuit evolves one day into a hostile ambush. Verse 11. But one day, just an average, ordinary day, when he went into the house to do his work, lo and behold, none of the men of the house was there in the house. That's strange, isn't it? I mean, how often does this happen? It's a very busy estate, a large household staff, everybody simultaneously out of the house. But someone was in the house. She was in the house. Verse 12, she caught him by his garment. The word actually implies an act of violence, saying, lie with me. Now, what options does Joseph have here? Surrender, give in? Not for Joseph. What about violence? He's bigger than she is. I'm sure he could easily knock her down. If he does that, he's a dead man. She is the master's wife. So for a moment here, zoom out with me out of this story, and let's think bigger. Let's think wider. What does the New Testament teach you about how to deal with sexual temptation in particular? Reason with it. Ask, what would Jesus do? Flirt with it right up until the point where it's really too big. Recite your vast arsenal of Bible verses at it. Now, the counsel and wisdom of the New Testament is born out of this very experience in Joseph's life. Flee. Run. Get away. And that's exactly what Joseph does. Lie with me, she says, but he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. You can picture, right? He leaves it in her hand. She's grabbing at him, and he sort of untangles himself from it and runs out of the house. And imagine that scene, a shirtless Joseph fleeing the house. That is a problem now for Mrs. Potiphar. If anybody sees that, or if Joseph told anybody else what happened, it's a problem. So she needs to control the narrative right now to turn this thing to her advantage. And here we're reminded that this is not primarily a story about how to resist sexual temptation. This is a story of God's divine providence. And it's important to be reminded again that providence is not the equivalent of Christian luck. Providence isn't limited just to the things that you think are good in your life. God's providence encompasses all aspects of your life, including the things that you think are bad. And we see that to be the case here, verse 13. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us." Now, I don't know if you noticed it here, but this woman is quick on her feet. Look what she does. She refers to Joseph, not by name, but as a Hebrew. Maybe playing on any anti-Semitic feelings that would be present there in Egypt. And then, what's more, to enlist the sympathy of her household staff, she refers to herself and them together as us. Right? Like she's on their level. Before it was always the help or those people. And now suddenly it's us. He came in to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. That's not exactly what happened, is it? Joseph didn't leave because she screamed because he left. And Joseph didn't leave his garment beside her like he removed it as he was preparing to assault her. No, he ran out of it, leaving it behind. So the household staff that she's talking to here, do they believe her? I don't think so. They know what kind of man Joseph is. They've worked with him for a decade. They know what kind of woman she is. It's interesting that there's no recorded response from the other slaves, but then again, what can they really say? You just don't cross a woman like Mrs. Potiphar. So there'll be no word from the staff here. But there's still a big problem because Joseph knows the real story. And so she quickly devises a plan here. She's quick. And this plan includes some incriminating words and a prop that is strategically placed to maximize the impact. Look at verse 16. Then she laid up his garment by her, right there beside her. You can see his tunic. Until his master came home, and she told him the same story, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came into me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house." Now notice here just the subtle difference in this version of the story. She implies that Potiphar shares the blame for this. Right? She'd hinted at that earlier in verse 14 when she said, "See, he has brought among us a Hebrew." But now here she's much more direct. "The Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us." You know, she's concerned. Sweetie, what does it look like if you, the head of Pharaoh's secret service, misjudged somebody's character so badly? I mean, you gave him unchecked authority over our entire estate, and he turns out to be some kind of sexual predator? I'm just worried, honey, if the word of this gets out. Actually, the staff, they already kind of know about it. But what if Pharaoh gets wind of this? What about your reputation? She's worried about him. No, you see what she's doing here? She's creating a context in which Potiphar is going to be forced to deal with Joseph, probably kill him. After all, that is the punishment for rape or attempted rape in ancient Egypt. Verse 19, as soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled. But notice there, who is he angry with? We're not told. The text is deliberately vague at that point. Now, think about this with me. Does Potiphar believe his wife? Don't forget, he's the head of the Egyptian secret service. He is an astute judge of character. He has to be in a role like that. It's what he gets paid to do, to see through lies. More than that, he's married to her. He knows what kind of woman she is. He also knows what kind of man Joseph is. And for a guy like Potiphar, it would be so easy to make a problem like Joseph just disappear, wouldn't it? I mean, after all, he is the chief of the executioners. If Potiphar really thought that Joseph tried to rape his wife, do you really think that he would spare him, even for old time's sake? Does he believe his wife? Nevertheless, once again, Joseph finds himself in the pit. And things are worse now than they were before. This is the wickedness and consequence of sin. And it doesn't feel like winning, does it? In fact, it feels wrong. It feels unfair, unjust. Joseph refuses sexual sin. He rejects that great wickedness. He honors God's standard. and he ends up in prison? Let's look here now at the closing paragraph. As I said before, it's nearly identical to the opening paragraph, so we'll call it the same thing, the presence and blessing of God. Verse 20. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph, just like the opening paragraph, and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in sight of the keeper of the prison, just like the opening paragraph. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. Just like the opening paragraph, verse 23, the keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. Just like the opening paragraph. So you have the opening paragraph, which is the presence and blessing of God. The closing paragraph, which is the presence and blessing of God. Not by accident, but designed to frame the very dark, ugly middle paragraph, the wickedness and consequence of sin. And it is structured like this to help us understand how to interpret the dark events in Joseph's life and the dark events in your life. Especially in those moments when winning feels like losing. Because life for God's people takes place in a fallen, broken, sinful world. A world that is filled with deceit and disappointment and suffering and evil and pain. And things can always get worse, can't they? And then, as we see here, obedience to God doesn't even guarantee a favorable result for you. And yet at the same time, we're told that God is present with his people even in the worst circumstances. And so that's important for you because whatever darkness is occurring in the middle paragraphs of your life, maybe even right now, you can be certain of this, that God is at work for you, using and even orchestrating every dark thing that you experience. There are a lot of advantages to suffering for righteousness' sake. Suffering for righteousness' sake is one way that proves that you belong to God. Suffering for righteousness' sake is God's tool to mold your character. Suffering for righteousness' sake allows you to display God's strength in your life. So why does it feel like losing? You've read this book. Haven't you noticed? This is how God delights to work in his people. Always humiliation prior to exaltation. Think of Moses. Before he led God's people out of Egypt, he's forced to live for 40 years in the desert, being reminded each day of the negative consequences of relying on his own power. Humiliation prior to exaltation. Think of David, named the heir to the throne of Israel, on the run for years from a desperate and fearful man. It's humiliation prior to exaltation. Think about Hosea, commissioned to speak God's word, told to marry a prostitute who eventually abandons him and their children. Humiliation prior to exaltation. And what about the one who is greater than Hosea, greater than Moses, greater than David, the greater prophet, the greater priest, the greater king, leaving the glories of heaven, emptying himself, taking the form of a servant, betrayed by Judas, denied by Peter, abandoned by the disciples, rejected by the Jews, convicted by Pilate, beaten and crucified by the Romans, and worst of all, my God, why have you forsaken me?" You may not approve of God's methodology, but at the very least you must say this: God took his own medicine. Humiliation prior to exaltation. Moses led the Exodus. David ruled God's people. Hosea proclaimed God's word. Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And Joseph? He too will be exalted, but not before experiencing more humiliation. It's been said that out of the presses of pain come the soul's best wine. Why does winning so often feel like losing? Because losing is God's strategy that prepares you to win, preparing you for purposes that at this present moment you may know nothing about. In fact, you probably don't. Think about Joseph at this point in the story. What does he know? He refused to sin, and he's thrown into prison. That's all he knows. The Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was with Joseph. 4 times we're told that. What is that? Really? You call this being with me? Yeah, God does. Because he refused to sin, he's thrown into prison. Because he's thrown into prison, he meets the chief cupbearer. Because he meets the chief cupbearer, he interprets his dream. Because he interprets his dream, he later interprets Pharaoh's dream. Because he interprets Pharaoh's dream, he becomes prime minister. Because he becomes prime minister, the Egyptians are saved from famine. Because the Egyptians are saved from famine, Joseph's own family is saved from starvation. Because Joseph's own family is saved from starvation, the messianic line continues. And because the messianic line continues, Jesus Christ has come to be your Savior. Why? Because Joseph refused to sin and was sent to prison unjustly because of it. 100 years or so after Jesus lived, a man approached the great church father Tertullian with a problem. His business interests now conflicted with his Christian faith and loyalty to God. And he said, "What can I do?" he asked. "I must live." And Tertullian replied, "Must you?" Dear Christian, you have no idea what glorious consequences may result from your obedience, even if the immediate result seems harsh or unjust or even pointless. Consequences for you, consequences for your spouse, for your children, your grandchildren, for the church of Jesus Christ, for God's eternal purposes. Here we have a man refusing to engage in sexual sin, and that proves to be the means of advancing the seed of the woman who will come to crush the serpent's head. And the result is the salvation of all who will believe. God wins. We win. Don't ever forget that. And in the meantime, when winning feels like losing, as it so often does, always remember this. The same Lord who was with Joseph says to you, "I will never leave you nor forsake you. Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." Now, who is it that said that? Who made that promise? "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel," which means God with us.
We would like to thank you for joining us for the Victory Podcast today. This podcast is a ministry of Victory Baptist Church in Hermiston, Oregon. You can find us at 193 East Main Street in Hermiston, Oregon, 97838, or on the web at yourvictory.org.